Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's have a story. Okay.
The galaxy runs on assumptions. Empires rise because they believe in their superiority. Treaties hold because both sides assume the other won't cross certain lines. Wars end when one side assumes the other has nothing left to give. But assumptions about humanity, those don't just break, they shatter. The conclave chamber smelled like ozone and old power. Kyle Tross had stood in rooms like this before. High ceilings that made you feel small, lighting that came from nowhere and everywhere, the kind of architectural intimidation that reminded you exactly where you stood in the pecking order of the known universe. Nowhere good, usually. The 9 species of the galactic sovereignty sat in their designated sections, each cluster a small galaxy of robes, exoskeletons, breathing apparatus. Been in the general air of beings who'd never had to fight for a meal in their lives. The Velkari occupied the eastern wing, their crystalline bodies refracting light into sharp rainbows across the obsidian floor. To the west, the Draum huddled in their environmental suits, their methane atmosphere hissing softly through recyclers. The Torth delegation sat near the center, as always, their forearms folded in that way that suggested they were either deep in meditation or profoundly bored. Kale Tross was neither meditating nor bored. He was calculating. The human stood at the bottom of the chamber, alone in the supplicant's circle. Standard procedure for first contact species seeking admission to the sovereignty. You came, you presented your case. But you waited while beings who'd been traveling the stars for 10,000 years decided whether your species was worth the paperwork. Most weren't. She didn't look like much. Average height for a human, Kyle Tross had reviewed the files such as they were. Brown skin, dark hair pulled back in some kind of functional knot, wearing what appeared to be a plain grey suit that wouldn't have looked out of place on a cargo hauler. No ornamentation, no visible weapons, though the security scan had flagged something organic in her bloodstream that the system couldn't identify. Probably some primitive augmentation. The younger species always tried to level the playing field with cheap biologics. Her name was Dr. Amara Okonkwo, and according to the brief Kale Tross had skimmed that morning, she was some kind of scientist. Exobiologist, the file said, which seemed optimistic, given that humanity had only encountered 2 other species before stumbling into sovereignty space 3 cycles ago. Stumbling. That was the word the Velkari ambassador had used in the preliminary session. They stumbled into our sector like drunken Grell, firing up a hyperspace engine they barely understood, and now they want a seat at the table. The Draum representative had clicked something that the translator rendered as laughter. Kale Tross hadn't laughed. He'd been in intelligence long enough to know that drunken luck could be more dangerous than calculated precision. The species that stumbled sometimes stumbled into things that the careful ones spent centuries avoiding. But that didn't mean he was going to make this easy. He rose from his seat, and his scaled hide catching the ambient light in a way that he knew made him look larger, more predatory. Theatrical maybe, but theatre had its place in politics. Dr. Okonkwo, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber without need for amplification. The Torth had designed the acoustics that way. Another small reminder that you were in someone else's house, playing by someone else's rules. You stand before the galactic sovereignty as a representative of the species Homo sapiens. Do you understand the gravity of this proceeding? She looked up at him. Didn't flinch, which was something. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. I do, she said. Her voice was steady. No tremor, no hesitation. The translator earpiece rendered it in flat sovereignty standard, stripping whatever emotional texture her native language might have carried. Your species has submitted a petition for Tier 3 membership, Kyle Tross continued, pacing along the raised platform where the primary delegates sat. This is an unusual request. Most species spend decades in observer status, demonstrating their capacity for interstellar cooperation, their technological stability, their cultural coherence. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Humanity has been known to us for less than 3 standard cycles. Your probe encountered one of our deep space monitoring stations. You transmitted a greeting. We responded. And now, barely 1,000 days later, you're asking for full membership rights. He turned to face her directly. Why should we grant this request? The human, Amara, tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question from multiple angles. Because you're curious, she said. Someone in the Velkari section made a sound like wind through broken glass. Amusement, maybe. Or offense. Hard to tell with Velkari. Kael'Tros narrowed his eyes. Curiosity is not a currency we recognize in these proceedings. Isn't it? Amara took a step forward, still well within the supplicant's circle, but the movement carried intention. Your species, the Kyle, right? You've been part of the sovereignty for 6,000 years. You've explored 72% of this galactic arm. You've catalogued 400 sentient species, absorbed 112 into the sovereignty framework, and established trade relationships with most of the rest. She wasn't reading from anything, just speaking, as if the numbers were tattooed on the inside of her skull. You've seen ice worlds and lava worlds and gas giants with crystalline cores. You've encountered silicon-based life and energy beings and hive minds that span solar systems. You've done it all, catalogued it all, filed it all away in those vast databases you're so proud of. Kael'Tros felt something cold settle at the base of his spine. She was supposed to be pleading, making a case, not... And you're bored out of your minds, Amara finished. The chamber went very, very quiet. That's why you responded to our probe, she continued, her voice carrying that same steady cadence. Not because we were impressive, not because our technology was noteworthy, but because we were different in a way you hadn't catalogued yet. We didn't fit the pattern. She gestured around the chamber, taking in the assembled delegates. Every species here followed the same basic trajectory, didn't they? Develop tool use, harness fire or its equivalent, discover agriculture, build cities, invent writing, pursue science, crack nuclear physics, achieve orbit, explore your local stellar neighborhood, stumble onto the hyperspace threshold, and then... She snapped her fingers. The sound echoed. You found out you weren't alone. You met the sovereignty, or the sovereignty met you, and you were welcomed into the galactic community. The Torth ambassador shifted in his seat, forearms unfolding slightly. Your point, human? His voice came through the translator with a resonance that suggested either deep authority or profound irritation. My point, Amara said, turning to face him directly, is that humanity didn't follow that pattern. We cracked nuclear physics, sure. Achieved orbit. Even made it to our moon with chemical rockets and computers that had less processing power than the translator earpiece I'm wearing right now. She tapped the small device fitted into her ear. But we didn't find you. You found us. And not because we went looking, but because we built something that shouldn't have worked. A hyperspace engine based on mathematics we barely understood, powered by exotic matter we created by accident in a particle accelerator, shielded by fields we can't fully explain even now. The Velkari ambassador leaned forward, her crystalline body chiming softly. Are you suggesting your species achieved faster than light travel through accident? I'm saying we built something that worked without fully understanding why it worked, Amara replied, which is very human if you look at our history. We flew before we understood aerodynamics. We cured diseases before we understood germ theory. We harnessed electricity before we could explain what electrons actually were. She smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Kael'Tros's scales prickle. We have a saying on Earth, fake it till you make it. We're exceptionally good at building bridges out of sticks and prayer, walking across them, and only then turning around to figure out why they didn't collapse. The Drown representative made that clicking sound again, but this time it didn't sound like laughter. Kael'Tros stepped down from the platform, descending the steps until he was level with the supplicant's circle. Close enough to see the small details the scanners missed, The faint scars on her hands, the way her eyes tracked his movement with something that might have been threat assessment. The absolute lack of deference in her posture. "You're making an argument for your species' recklessness," he said softly, "not your competence." "I'm making an argument for our adaptability," Amara corrected. "Every species in this room achieved technological advancement through steady, incremental progress. You built on what came before. You followed logical steps. You had time to develop ethical frameworks and social structures that could support your technology." She gestured vaguely upward toward the vast ceiling and the stars beyond. "Humanity didn't have that luxury. We went from riding horses to splitting atoms in less than 200 years. We had stone tools 12,000 years ago. Now we're here. That kind of exponential growth should have destroyed us. Most species don't survive their own development curve. There's probably a dozen extinct civilizations in this sector alone who proved that." The Torth ambassador nodded slowly. "The Great Filter. Yes, most pre-contact species self-destruct during their industrial or nuclear phases. But we didn't," Amara said. "We came close, closer than I think you realize. But we survived. Not because we're smarter than other species, or more enlightened, or more peaceful. We survived because when we stare into the abyss, when we push ourselves to the absolute brink of annihilation." She paused, and her voice dropped to something quieter, something that carried more weight than any shout. "We step back. Not always immediately, not always gracefully, but eventually, we step back." Kael'Tros studied her face. Human expressions were still somewhat opaque to him, but he'd learned enough to recognize the difference between performance and genuine conviction. This was conviction. "So you're asking us to grant membership to a species that admits to nearly destroying itself?" he asked. "I'm asking you to grant membership to a species that's still learning," Amara replied. "Still adapting. Still figuring out how to be better than we were yesterday. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us interesting." She met his gaze, and for a moment, Kael'Tros had the unsettling sensation of being evaluated rather than evaluating. "You've spent 6,000 years perfecting your civilization," she continued, "building a society so stable, so carefully balanced, that nothing ever really changes. You've eliminated war, poverty, disease. You've created paradise." Her smile was slight, almost sad. "And in doing so, you've eliminated the need to evolve. You've reached the end state, the final form. You're done." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. "But humanity?" Amara shook her head. "We're not done. We're barely started. We're going to make mistakes, probably catastrophic ones. We're going to ask stupid questions and propose insane solutions and try things that any reasonable species would know are impossible." She spread her hands. "And sometimes, just sometimes, those impossible things are going to work. And when they do, we're going to share them with you. Because that's also very human. We're terrible at keeping secrets from people we consider friends." The Velkari ambassador's body chimed again, a complex pattern that the translator struggled with before settling on. "Fascinating. And arrogant." "Probably," Amara agreed, "but arrogance and confidence look pretty similar from the outside. The only difference is whether you can back it up." Kael'Tros returned to the platform, his mind working through scenarios, calculating outcomes. The human's performance was compelling. He'd give her that. But performance wasn't evidence. "You've made your philosophical argument," he said, settling back into his seat. "Now, make your practical one. What does humanity offer the sovereignty? What resources, what technologies, what strategic advantages justify granting membership to a species that's still learning not to annihilate itself?" Amara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. A subtle settling, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this question. "I was hoping you'd ask that," she said. She reached into her jacket, slowly, carefully, in a way that wouldn't alarm the security systems, and withdrew a small transparent case. Inside, suspended in some kind of stasis field, was what looked like a seed, roughly ovoid, mottled brown and green, utterly unremarkable. She held it up. "This is a Terran organism," she said. "Genus Pisum, species Sativum. You'd call it a garden pea. It's been genetically modified to produce a protein chain that doesn't exist in nature, at least not in any nature we've encountered so far." She tossed the case gently upward. It hung in the air for a moment, caught in the chamber's gravity manipulation field, rotating slowly. That protein chain, when introduced to silicon-based cellular matrices, it acts as a catalyst for neural pathway formation. Essentially, it allows silicon-based life forms to develop higher cognitive functions at roughly 10 times the normal rate. The Velkari ambassador stood abruptly, her crystalline body flashing with colors that the translator rendered as shock-surprised disbelief. "That's impossible," she said. "The Velkari have been trying to solve the developmental delay problem for 3,000 years. Our brightest minds, our most advanced laboratories, couldn't crack it," Amara finished. "I know. I read your literature. Brilliant work, really. You just approached it from the wrong angle." She plucked the case from the air. "You tried to modify the silicon matrix itself, to speed up the natural formation process. We modified the environment instead, built a biological scaffold that the silicon could grow along. Turns out, carbon-based proteins and silicon-based neural structures play together better than anyone expected." The case disappeared back into her jacket. "We've run trials with 3 volunteer Velkari from the observation station near Jupiter. Full informed consent, monitored every step of the way. All 3 showed dramatic improvements in cognitive development. No side effects that we can detect, though we're keeping them under observation for another standard cycle just to be sure." Cale Tross felt his earlier certainty beginning to fracture. "You're saying humanity solved a problem in 3 years that the Velkari couldn't solve in 3 millennia?" "No," Amara said. "I'm saying humanity solved it in 18 months. We only found out about the problem 3 years ago, right when we met our first Velkari. Took us 6 months to understand the issue, another 12 to develop and test a solution." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes, or eye equivalents, of each delegate in turn. "Want to know why we were so fast? Because we didn't know it was supposed to be impossible. We didn't have 3,000 years of failed experiments telling us all the ways it couldn't work. We just had the problem, and our entire species' history of stubbornly refusing to accept that some things can't be done." The Torth ambassador's forearms moved in a gesture that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "One solution to one problem," he said. "Impressive, but hardly sufficient grounds for—" "It's not one solution," Amara interrupted. "It's a demonstration of methodology. The P was just the example I brought because it's the most immediately verifiable. But we've got teams working on the DRAM respiratory efficiency problem, the Torth quantum computation stability issue, and about a dozen other challenges that various sovereignty species have been struggling with for centuries." She paused. "We've solved 2 so far. We expect to crack at least 3 more within the next standard cycle." Silence filled the chamber, like water flooding a sealed room. Cale Tross broke it. "Why?" he asked. The word came out harsher than he'd intended, but he didn't soften it. "Why invest your limited resources in solving other species' problems? What's your angle?" Amara's smile was tired, genuine. "Because we can," she said simply. "Because every problem we solve is a problem that doesn't need solving anymore. Because humanity spent most of its history divided into tribes and nations and ideological blocks, fighting over resources and territory and ideas, and we're really, really tired of it." She gestured at the chamber, at the assembled delegates, at the vast structure of the sovereignty beyond. "You're offering us a chance to be part of something bigger, to contribute to a community that spans dozens of species and hundreds of worlds, to put our abilities towards something constructive instead of destructive." Her voice softened. "We'd be idiots to waste that opportunity trying to play political games or extract concessions." The Velkari ambassador had settled back into her seat, but her body still chimed with agitated colors. "You're proposing altruism," she said. "So pure cooperation with no expectation of reciprocity. I'm proposing partnership, Amara corrected. You've got the wisdom of ages, the stability of established civilization, the resources of hundreds of worlds. We've got creativity, adaptability, and a frankly concerning willingness to try things that should not work. She spread her hands. Combine those, and we might actually get somewhere interesting. Cale Tross leaned back in his seat, his mind running through implications, calculating risks, weighing outcomes. The human's proposal was either genuine or an extremely sophisticated manipulation. Both possibilities were troubling in different ways. The sovereignty will need to verify your claims, he said finally. The protein synthesis, the volunteer trials, the other projects you've mentioned, we'll need full access to your research, your methodologies, your facilities. Of course, Amara said. We've prepared complete documentation packages for each delegate species. They'll be transmitted to your respective science ministries within the hour. Too prepared. Too smooth. Cale Tross narrowed his eyes. You were very confident we'd ask for verification. I was confident you'd want evidence, Amara replied. That's what I'd want in your position. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We've got that evidence. We're happy to share it. The Drown representative made a sound like escaping steam. The translator rendered it as thoughtful consideration. Assuming your claims are verified, they said, their voice resonating through the methane recyclers, and assuming the sovereignty grants your petition for membership, what then? What are humanity's immediate priorities? Amara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, something deeper. We want to learn, she said. Everything you can teach us about surviving as a spacefaring species, about managing multi-world civilizations, about maintaining peace across cultural and biological divides. She looked up at the vast ceiling, at the representations of stars beyond. We want to explore. There are regions of the galaxy that the sovereignty hasn't fully mapped yet, frontiers that even you consider too dangerous or too remote. We'd like permission to investigate those regions, carefully, with proper protocols, but we'd like to look. Her gaze came back down, fixing on Cale Tross. And we want to contribute, to be useful, to be the species that other species call when they've got a problem that seems unsolvable, because we're apparently very good at solving those. She smiled slightly. Mostly because we're too stupid to know when to quit. The Torth ambassador made a sound that might have been a laugh. You're aware, he said, that this approach, this tendency toward reckless experimentation and impossible solutions will eventually result in catastrophic failure. That your species will attempt something that cannot be done and will destroy yourselves in the process. Probably, Amara agreed. But when we do, we'll do it far enough away from populated systems that we won't take anyone else with us. We're reckless, not malicious. Small comfort, the Velkari ambassador murmured. Maybe, Amara said. But it's the truth. Humanity has spent the last few centuries learning the hard way that our actions have consequences beyond our immediate borders. We've poisoned our own world, nearly sterilized it with our carelessness. We've built weapons capable of rendering our homeworld uninhabitable. We've stared into that particular abyss more times than I'd like to admit. Her expression hardened. But we learned. We stepped back. We're still stepping back every day, from 100 small apocalypses that we could trigger if we weren't careful. That kind of education doesn't come cheap, and we paid the price in blood and ash and ruined landscapes. She met each delegate's gaze in turn. So when I say, we'll be careful with your lives, with your worlds, with the stability of the sovereignty, I'm not making a promise based on good intentions. I'm making a promise based on hard experience. We know what happens when you're not careful. We've seen it. We've lived through it. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. We're not going to let that happen again. Not here. Not on our watch. The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Heavier. More considered. Cale Tross made his decision. The sovereignty will adjourn to review the evidence you've presented, he said formally. Deliberations will commence tomorrow at second zenith. You will be notified of our decision within 3 standard days. Amara nodded. Thank you for your time and consideration. She turned to leave the supplicant's circle, her movements economical, controlled. Not hurried, but not lingering either. Dr. Okonkwo, Kyle Tross said. She paused, looking back. One final question, he said. Personal curiosity, not official record. Why you? Why did humanity send a biologist to make their case for membership instead of a diplomat or a politician or a military commander? Amara's smile was small, almost private. Because diplomats are trained to negotiate, she said. Politicians are trained to persuade. Military commanders are trained to intimidate. We didn't want to do any of those things. She gestured at the chamber, at the assembled delegates, at the vast structure of power and authority that surrounded them. We wanted to understand, to learn, to find common ground in shared curiosity about how the universe works. Her smile widened slightly. Turns out, biologists are pretty good at that. We spend our whole careers studying things that are fundamentally alien to us. Trying to figure out how they function, how they survive, how they fit into the larger ecosystem. She shrugged. Seemed appropriate. Then she was gone, leaving through the main entrance with the same unhurried efficiency she'd displayed throughout the proceeding. Kyle Tross watched her go, then turned to face the assembled delegates. Well, he said, that was different. The Velkari ambassador's body chimed with a pattern that suggested both amusement and concern. Different, she agreed, and potentially catastrophic. Or revolutionary, the Torth ambassador countered. We won't know until we've examined their research. The Drom representative made that hissing steam sound again. I propose, they said, that we examine it very, very carefully. Kale Tross nodded slowly. Agreed, he said. But even as he spoke, as he was thinking about the human's smile, about the casual confidence in her voice when she'd described her species' tendency toward reckless innovation, about the way she'd looked at him when she'd said, "We're not done. We're barely started." And for the first time in 6,000 years of Kale Tross's civilization, for the first time in a career spent evaluating threats and opportunities across hundreds of worlds, he wasn't sure whether that prospect excited him or terrified him. Possibly both. The verification chamber was smaller than the conclave room, which somehow made it worse. Less theatrical, more surgical. White walls that seemed to absorb sound. Examination tables arranged in precise rows. Monitoring equipment that hummed at frequencies just below comfortable hearing. Amara stood in the center of it all. Watching as Velkari scientists swarmed over the protein samples she'd provided like jewelers examining a suspicious diamond. They'd been at it for 6 hours. She'd stopped checking her chronometer after the 4th. Dr. Shasila, the lead Velkari researcher, moved with the kind of precise deliberation that spoke of either extreme care or extreme skepticism. Her crystalline body refracted the laboratory light into geometric patterns across the floor, creating shadows that shifted whenever she moved. Beautiful, actually. Amara had spent the first hour cataloguing the color variations, mapping them to probable emotional states based on the literature she'd absorbed during the flight here. Red-orange clusters, frustration or confusion. Blue-green striations, intense focus. But purple undertones. Something the translator database listed as cognitive dissonance adjacent to wonder. Right now, Shasila was displaying all three simultaneously. This should not work, the Velkari scientist said for the 17th time. Her voice came through the translator with harmonics that suggested she was arguing with herself as much as with Amara. The protein folding alone requires environmental conditions that would denature any carbon-based catalyst. The binding sites you've engineered shouldn't recognize silicon matrix structures. The entire theoretical framework contradicts 4 fundamental principles of xenobiology. Amara nodded. I know. Then how? We ignored the framework, Amara said, started from scratch. Pretended we didn't know anything about silicon-based biology and just tried things. Shasila's body flashed a color that Amara's translator struggled with before settling on exasperation bordering on admiration. You experimented blindly? Not blindly, Amara corrected. We just didn't let theory tell us what was impossible before we'd tested it. Ran about 40,000 variations through simulation, narrowed it down to 300 promising candidates, tested those in controlled environments, refined the top 20, and ended up with this. She gestured at the sample vials arranged on the examination table. Took 18 months and the combined computing power of Earth's 3 largest research networks. But yeah, we found it. Shasila approached the samples, her crystalline fingers extending delicate sensory filaments that could detect molecular structures at the atomic level. And Amara had watched this process enough times now to recognize the small movements that indicated deep analysis. The volunteer trials, Shasila said quietly. The 3 Velkari from your Jupiter station. You have full records? Complete neural scans, genetic panels, behavioral assessments, daily observation logs. Amara pulled up a holographic display from her wrist interface. Subject 1 showed a 34% improvement in pattern recognition within the first week. Subject 2 developed abstract reasoning capabilities that normally take our species 7 years to manifest. Subject 3. She paused, checking the file. Subject 3 started composing music, which, according to your own literature, is a cognitive function that requires specific neural architecture that doesn't normally develop in Velkari until late adolescence. Shasila went very still. How old was Subject 3? 4 standard cycles, Amara said, equivalent to a human 6-year-old, developmentally. The colors rippling through Shasila's body cycled too fast for the translator to pass. When she spoke again, her voice carried something that might have been grief, or might have been rage, or might have been both. Do you understand what you've done? She asked. My daughter is 8 cycles old. By Velkari standards, she won't develop higher cognitive functions for another 12 cycles. She won't be able to attend university, pursue advanced studies, contribute to our society in any meaningful intellectual capacity until she's 20 cycles old. Shasila turned to face Amara directly. That's 15 years of her life spent waiting for her mind to catch up to her curiosity. 15 years of watching other species, carbon-based species, develop and learn and grow while she's trapped in a cognitive childhood that she can't escape. Her voice cracked. My daughter asks me why she can't understand the things her friends understand. Why she can't learn calculus when the 4th child next door is already solving quantum equations. Why her brain won't work the way she wants it to work. Amara felt something cold settle in her chest. I didn't know, she said quietly. Of course you didn't. Shasila's colors shifted towards something the translator rendered as bitter resignation. So why would you? You're carbon-based. Your children develop cognitive abilities at roughly the same rate as every other carbon-based species in the sovereignty. You've never had to explain to a 6-year-old why she has to wait another 14 years before she can think properly. She gestured at the protein samples. And now you show up with this. This impossible thing that shouldn't work. This solution that we've been searching for since before your species learned to write. And you did it in 18 months because you didn't know it was impossible. Amara opened her mouth. Closed it, tried to find words that didn't sound hollow. I'm sorry, she said finally. That's not enough, I know, but I'm sorry that your daughter has to wait, that any Velkari child has to wait. Shasila's colors cycled through something complex, multi-layered. Don't apologize, she said. Fix it. We're trying to... No. Shasila moved closer, her crystalline body refracting light in sharp angles. I mean, fix it now. Today. This protocol you've developed, we need to begin mass production immediately. Clinical trials across all Velkari worlds. Deployment within 6 months. Amara blinked. That's ambitious. We've only tested it on 3 subjects. We'd need larger trial groups, longer observation periods, peer review. How long? Shasila interrupted. How long for what? How long have your 3 volunteers been using the protein treatment? Amara checked her files. Subject 1 has been on the protocol for 8 standard months. Subjects 2 and 3 for 6 months. And the side effects? None that we can detect. But 6 to 8 months isn't enough time to rule out long-term. It's enough, Shasila said. For us, it's enough. She turned back to the examination table, her sensory filaments extending toward the samples with something that looked like desperation. You don't understand what it's like, she said quietly. To watch your child struggle with concepts that should be simple. To see the frustration in her eyes when she can't grasp ideas that her peers find elementary. To know that there's nothing wrong with her, that she's perfectly healthy by our standards, but that our standards condemn her to more than a decade of cognitive limitation. Her colors shifted towards something dark, something that pulsed like a bruise. If this treatment works, if it's even half as effective as your data suggests, it will change everything for our species. Our children won't have to wait anymore. They can learn, grow, develop at rates comparable to the rest of the galactic community. She looked at Amara, and despite the alien physiology, despite the crystalline structure that bore no resemblance to human features, Amara could read the expression. Hope, raw, and desperate. Please, Shasila said, let us try. Amara was quiet for a long moment, running calculations in her head, weighing risks against potential benefits, considering all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Then she thought about a 6-year-old Velkari child asking her mother why her brain didn't work right. Okay, she said, but we do this carefully. Controlled rollout, close monitoring, clear protocols for reporting any adverse effects. And we need the Sovereignty Medical Council's approval before we expand beyond the initial test group. Shasila's body flared with colors that cycled too fast to translate, but the meaning was clear enough. Yes, she said. Yes. Whatever protocols you need. Whatever safety measures you require. We'll follow them all. She moved toward the laboratory's communication panel, her movements suddenly urgent. I need to contact the Velkari Medical Directorate and the family advocacy groups and... She paused, turning back to Amara. Thank you, she said simply. Amara nodded, not trusting herself to speak, because she'd just realized something that made her earlier confidence in the conclave chamber feel like arrogance. Humanity hadn't just developed a treatment for a biological problem. They'd stumbled into the middle of a species collective trauma, a cultural wound that had been bleeding for thousands of years. And now they were responsible for it. The weight of that settled on her shoulders like a physical thing. 3 days later, Amara stood in a different chamber entirely. This one was vast, circular, with a ceiling that curved upward into what appeared to be direct exposure to open space. Stars glittered overhead, impossibly close, impossibly bright. Some kind of force field or advanced holography. Amara hadn't figured out which yet. The delegates sat in concentric circles, with the primary species occupying the inner ring and observer species arranged in the outer tiers. Hundreds of beings, representing dozens of civilizations, all gathered for the formal vote on humanity's petition. See, Kale Tross stood at the central podium, his scaled form imposing against the starfield backdrop. The verification period has concluded, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber without need for amplification. The Sovereignty Science Council has reviewed humanity's submitted research. We will now hear their findings. A Torth scientist stepped forward, her forearms carrying data tablets that floated in formation around her like attendant moons. The human protein synthesis protocol has been verified as genuine and functional, she said, her voice flat, clinical. Independent replication of their methodology produced identical results. The treatment demonstrates significant efficacy in accelerating cognitive development in silicon-based life forms, with no detectable adverse effects in the current trial population. She manipulated one of the floating tablets, and a holographic display materialized above the central podium. Additionally, the humans have provided preliminary research on 14 other sovereignty-related challenges. Of these, 2 have already been solved and verified: the Drom respiratory efficiency problem and the Kesetar genetic drift stabilization issue. 3 others show promising initial results. The Torth scientist looked directly at Amara, and there was something in her expression that might have been respect or might have been fear. In summary, she said, humanity has demonstrated extraordinary problem-solving capabilities, particularly in areas where conventional research has reached apparent dead ends. Their methodology is unorthodox, their approach is frequently reckless, but their results are undeniable. She stepped back, and Kyle Tross resumed his position at the podium. The floor is now open for delegate commentary before the vote, he said. The Velkari ambassador stood immediately, her crystalline body chiming with harmonics that suggested barely controlled emotion. I have been a member of this sovereignty for 300 standard years, she said. In that time, I have witnessed the admission of 17 new species. Each followed the standard protocol. Decades of observation, careful integration, gradual acceptance into our community. She turned to look at Amara, who stood in the supplicant's circle for what she hoped was the last time. Dude, humanity has been known to us for less than 3 years. By every conventional metric, they should remain in observer status for at least another 2 decades. Their technology is primitive, their social structures are unstable, their tendency towards self-destruction is well documented. The chamber was silent, waiting. But they solved a problem in 18 months that we couldn't solve in 3,000 years, the Valkyrie ambassador continued. They looked at our species' greatest tragedy, the developmental delay that has defined Valkyrie childhood for our entire recorded history, and they fixed it. Her voice softened. My colleague, Dr. Shasila, has a daughter, 8 years old. Yesterday, that child received the human treatment. This morning, she solved a mathematical proof that Valkyrie children don't typically comprehend until they're 15. The ambassador's colors shifted through the entire visible spectrum. Shasila called me at third zenith. She was crying. I have never heard a Valkyrie cry before. I didn't know we could. She turned to face the assembled delegates. I vote to grant humanity full Tier 3 membership, she said. Immediately, without the standard waiting period, without the usual restrictions. She sat down, her crystalline body still chiming with residual emotion. The chamber erupted. Delegates spoke over each other, voices overlapping in a dozen languages that the translator struggled to pass. Some shouted support, others raised objections. A few simply sat in stunned silence. And Kyle Tross let it continue for exactly 30 seconds before activating the podium's resonance system. A low pulse filled the chamber, not loud enough to be painful, but insistent enough to demand attention. Silence returned. Additional commentary? Kyle Tross asked. The Drown representative stood, their methane suit hissing softly. I share the Valkyrie ambassador's sentiment, they said. The human solution to our respiratory efficiency problem has already been implemented in 17 Drown colonies. Mortality rates during high exertion activities have dropped by 43%. Children born with compromised pulmonary systems, a death sentence under our previous limitations, now survive to adulthood. They paused. Humanity didn't ask for compensation, didn't demand concessions. They simply provided the research freely, marched with complete documentation, and offered to assist with implementation if needed. The Drown representative's suit cycled through what might have been a sigh. I vote in favor of immediate membership. More delegates stood. More testimonials. The Kesatar delegation described how human genetic stabilization protocols had halted a drift crisis that threatened their species' long-term viability. The Torth spoke about quantum computation breakthroughs that had eluded their finest minds for centuries. Even species that hadn't directly benefited from human research spoke in favor, citing potential future applications. The value of innovative thinking, the need for new perspectives in a sovereignty that had grown comfortable in its own stability. Not everyone agreed. A contingent of Horm delegates argued that humanity was too volatile, too unpredictable, that granting the membership would destabilize the careful balance the sovereignty had maintained for millennia. The Zrel representative pointed out that humanity still had active military conflicts on their homeworld, that they'd nearly destroyed themselves with nuclear weapons less than a century ago. that their track record for peaceful coexistence was abysmal by sovereignty standards. Valid points, all of them. Amara listened to the debate with something that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground beneath her feet would hold or give way. Finally, Kale Tross called for order again. "We will now proceed to the vote," he said. "All delegates in favor of granting Homo sapiens immediate Tier 3 membership in the galactic sovereignty, signify approval." Lights appeared throughout the chamber, green indicators floating above each delegation section. Amara counted them without meaning to. Velkari, green. Draum, green. Torth, green. Kestar, green. Down the list, species after species, a constellation of approval spreading across the chamber like stars igniting. Not unanimous. The Horm and Zrel delegations held out, their indicators remaining stubbornly dark. A few others abstained, but the green lights vastly outnumbered the holdouts. "The vote is decided," Kyle Tross announced. "Humanity is hereby granted Tier 3 membership in the galactic sovereignty, with all associated rights and responsibilities. Effective immediately." He turned to Amara. "Welcome, Dr. Okonkwo. Welcome to the sovereignty." The chamber erupted again, but this time it was celebration rather than debate. Delegates stood, made gestures of approval or respect in their various cultural traditions, generated sounds that ranged from harmonious chiming to what sounded like controlled explosions. Amara just stood there, trying to process the moment, trying to feel something other than overwhelming relief mixed with terrifying responsibility. "We did it. We're in. Now we have to prove we deserve it." The reception following the vote was held in one of the sovereignty's formal gardens, though garden was an inadequate term for what was essentially a carefully orchestrated ecosystem spanning multiple biomes under a single environmental dome. So Amara walked through sections that ranged from crystalline forests that chimed in harmonic resonance to bioluminescent swamps that pulsed with rhythms that might have been geological or might have been biological. Hard to tell. Delegates approached her in small groups, offering congratulations, asking questions about human research, requesting collaboration on various projects. She answered as best she could, distributed contact information for Earth's Science Directorate, promised follow-up meetings and data sharing, and all the diplomatic pleasantries that came with being the public face of a species that had just joined the galactic community. It was exhausting. She was contemplating the etiquette of simply disappearing into the bioluminescent swamp and pretending to be a local life form when Shasila found her. The Velkari scientist approached slowly, her crystalline body subdued, colors muted. "Dr. Okonkwo," she said, "may I speak with you privately?" Amara nodded, grateful for the excuse to extract herself from the crowd. They walked to a quieter section of the garden, where something that resembled earth moss covered the ground in soft purple waves that responded to footsteps by briefly glowing brighter. "I wanted to thank you again," Shasila said, "for the treatment, for my daughter." "You already thanked me," Amara replied. "Several times." "I know." Shasila's colors shifted towards something that might have been embarrassment. "But I also wanted to apologize." Amara frowned. "For what?" "For the pressure I put on you. In the laboratory." Shasila's voice was quiet. "I was desperate. I saw a solution to my daughter's struggle. And I pushed for immediate implementation without considering the risks properly." She turned to face Amara directly. "You could have said no. You should have said no. The medical protocols exist for good reasons, and I was asking you to bypass them because of my personal emotional investment." Amara was quiet for a moment, watching the purple moss pulse beneath their feet. "I didn't say no because I understood the desperation," she said finally. "Because I've felt it. Different context, different circumstances, but the same fundamental thing. Watching someone you care about suffer from something that seems fixable if only the universe would cooperate." She met Shasila's gaze. "My brother had a genetic condition, degenerative, terminal. He died when I was 17. For years after, I dreamed about going back in time with knowledge we didn't have then, treatments that didn't exist yet, and fixing it. Saving him. Her voice was steady, but the words carried weight. So, when you talked about your daughter, about her struggling with something that had a potential solution, I understood. Not intellectually, not professionally. I understood it in the part of me that still dreams about my brother. Shasila's colors cycled through something complex, something the translator didn't even attempt to pass. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss." "It was a long time ago," Amara replied. It was the truth. It was also completely irrelevant to how it felt. They stood in silence for a while, surrounded by alien vegetation and the distant sounds of the reception. "Your species frightens me," Shasila said eventually. Oh, Amara raised an eyebrow. "Because we're reckless? Because you care so much." Shasila gestured vaguely at the garden, the dome, the sovereignty beyond. Most species, when they achieve this level of civilization, they've learned to temper their emotional responses. They've developed philosophical frameworks for accepting suffering, for managing loss, for maintaining equilibrium in the face of tragedy. Her colors shifted darker. But humans, you're advanced enough to reach the stars, but you still feel everything with the same intensity you probably felt when you were barely sentient. You experience loss and grief and desperation as if they were fresh wounds, even when the rational part of your mind knows better. She turned to Amara. "That should make you weak, should make you easy to manipulate, easy to predict. But instead, it makes you dangerous, because you'll attempt impossible things, take insane risks, break fundamental rules of science and nature, all because someone you care about is suffering and you can't bear to accept it." Amara considered that. "You're right," she said finally. "We do care too much, feel too deeply. We're terrible at letting go, worse at accepting limits." She smiled slightly. "But that's also why we're here. Why we reached the stars despite having technology that barely works, despite nearly destroying ourselves a dozen times over, despite every logical reason to give up or burn out or collapse under the weight of our own dysfunction." Her smile widened. "We're too stubborn to quit, too emotional to accept impossible. You're too invested in each other's survival to let minor things like physics or biology or common sense stand in our way." Shasila's colors cycled through something that might have been admiration or concern. "Like I said," she murmured. "Dangerous." "Probably," Amara agreed. "But we're your kind of dangerous now. Sovereignty dangerous. We'll try to be careful with it." Shasila made a sound that the translator rendered as soft laughter. "I don't think you know how," she said. "We'll learn," Amara replied. They stood together in the alien garden, under a dome that held a dozen ecosystems in careful balance, representatives of two species that had nothing in common except a shared tendency toward hope in the face of impossible odds. Amara's communicator chimed. She checked it, frowned. "I have to go," she said. "Apparently Earth is calling an emergency session. They want to discuss our new responsibilities as sovereignty members." Shasila's colors brightened. "When will you return?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. We need to coordinate research teams, establish formal diplomatic channels, set up the infrastructure for ongoing collaboration." Amara grimaced. "Lots of bureaucracy, lots of meetings." "Welcome to galactic civilization," Shasila said dryly. Amara laughed. Then she left the garden, left the reception, returned to the human transport that would carry her home. But as she sat in the shuttle, watching the sovereignty station recede into the distance, she thought about Shasila's words. "Your species frightens me, because you care so much." Good, Amara thought, because the universe could use a little more terrifying compassion. And the crisis started 7 months after humanity joined the sovereignty. Amara was in her lab on Earth when the call came through. Not the polite diplomatic ping she'd gotten used to, but an emergency override that bypassed all standard protocols and projected Kale Tross's image directly into her workspace. with enough holographic fidelity that she could see the individual scales on his neck standing rigid with stress. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "How fast can you get to Covenant Station?" Amara glanced at the protein sequencer running its current analysis. 40 hours left on the cycle. Irreplaceable samples. 12 hours if I use a military transport, she said. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where we might lose a planet." She shut down the sequencer. Covenant Station orbited Velmor Prime, then the Velkari homeworld, in a slow dance that kept it positioned between the planet and its primary star. 300 kilometers of rotating habitat rings, research modules, and docking facilities that serviced everything from private shuttles to bulk freighters the size of small cities. Amara had been here twice before. Once for the formal integration ceremony after humanity's admission to the sovereignty, and once for a symposium on cross-species medical applications where she'd presented the cognitive enhancement protocol that had become known, somewhat embarrassingly, as the Okonkwo treatment. The station had been vibrant then, busy, the kind of controlled chaos that came with a major population center trying to coordinate the needs of a dozen different species with incompatible biologies. Now it felt like a tomb. The docking bay was nearly empty. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. The few beings she passed in the corridors moved with the hurried purpose of people trying very hard not to panic. Kyle Tross met her at the medical wing entrance. "Thank you for coming," he said, and there was something in his voice that Amara had never heard before. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. "What happened?" she asked. He led her through security checkpoints that barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. Down corridors that grew progressively more sterile, more isolated, until they reached a section of the medical wing that had been sealed off with containment protocols aggressive enough to sterilize anything short of a nuclear reaction. Through the observation window, Amara could see examination rooms filled with Velkari. Children, mostly. Lying on medical beds, their crystalline bodies dark, colors muted to almost nothing. 18 days ago, Kyle Tross said quietly, the first cases appeared. Velkari children who'd been on the cognitive enhancement protocol started experiencing neural degradation. Not immediately fatal, but progressive. Their higher cognitive functions began shutting down. Pattern recognition failed first. Then abstract reasoning. Then basic problem solving. He gestured at the observation window. Within a week, they'd regressed to cognitive levels below their pre-treatment baseline. Within 2 weeks, they'd lost most voluntary neural control. They can still perceive, still process sensory input, but they can't integrate it meaningfully. They're trapped in their own minds. Amara felt ice spread through her chest. "How many?" she asked. 43 confirmed cases, all children between 4 and 12 cycles old, all on the enhancement protocol. Kyle Tross's voice was flat, clinical, the tone of someone reporting disaster because emotion would break them. "We've suspended the treatment globally, pulled every child off the protocol, but we don't know if that will stop the progression." He turned to face her directly. "We don't know what we did wrong." Amara stared through the observation window at the rows of darkened Velkari children, her mind already running through protocols, trying to think of anything she might have missed, any variable she hadn't controlled for. "The original test subjects," she said, "the 3 volunteers from the Jupiter station." "Or are they?" "Unaffected," Kyle Tross said. "We've run every diagnostic we can think of. They're healthy, stable, showing continued positive results from the treatment with no signs of degradation." Amara frowned. "That doesn't make sense. If the protocol itself is flawed, if there's something fundamentally wrong with the protein synthesis, then all subjects should be affected," Kyle Tross finished. "But they're not. Just the children here. Just Velmor Prime." He pulled up a holographic display, medical data cascading in 3-dimensional structures that Amara's eyes couldn't quite follow. "We've compared genetic profiles, environmental factors, dietary variations, exposure histories. Nothing correlates. The affected children have nothing in common except their age range and their location. And the treatment, Amara said quietly. Oh, and the treatment, Cale Tross agreed. They stood in silence, watching the darkened children through the observation window. Dr. Shasila, Amara said, her daughter, was one of the first to fall ill, Cale Tross said. Shasila has been working around the clock, trying to find a cause, a cure, anything. She hasn't slept in 4 days. We had to sedate her 12 hours ago when she collapsed during a research session. Amara closed her eyes. This is my fault. The thought was immediate, visceral. She'd developed the protocol. She'd pushed for its deployment. She'd stood in front of the sovereignty and promised that humanity could solve impossible problems. And now she'd created a new problem that might be even worse than the original. I need access to everything, she said, opening her eyes. Patient files, genetic sequences, the environmental data, manufacturing records for the protein synthesis. Everything. Cale Tross nodded. You'll have full clearance, whatever you need. And I need to talk to the families, Amara added, the parents of the affected children. I need to understand the timeline, the progression, any details that might not be in the medical records. They're not in a state to... Cale Tross began. I don't care what state they're in, Amara interrupted. Their children are dying because of something I created. They deserve to look me in the eye while I try to fix it. Cale Tross studied her for a long moment. This isn't your fault, he said finally. Isn't it? Amara turned away from the observation window. I'm the one who said we'd tested it thoroughly. I'm the one who convinced Shasila it was safe. I'm the one who stood in front of the sovereignty and promised that humanity could be trusted with this kind of responsibility. Her voice hardened. So yes, actually, this is exactly my fault. She interviewed 17 families over the next 36 hours. Some were angry, screaming, demanding answers, threatening legal action and diplomatic consequences and violence that would probably have been justified. Some were broken, quiet, moving through the world like ghosts, speaking in monotones about children who'd been bright and curious and full of potential just weeks ago. One father sat across from her in the sterile interview room and simply wept. Didn't say a word, just cried, while Amara asked her questions and recorded his silence. The patterns didn't emerge immediately, but by the 15th interview, Amara started noticing something. The affected children all came from the northern continent. All lived within a specific geographic region. All attended schools in districts that shared certain infrastructure, water treatment facilities, power grids, atmospheric processes. She cross-referenced the data with the medical files. There. Not a genetic factor, not a flaw in the protein synthesis. Environmental contamination. Trace elements in the local water supply. Naturally occurring crystalline minerals that were harmless to Velkari under normal circumstances, but that interacted with the enhancement protocol's protein chains in ways that created neural feedback loops. The protein was supposed to build scaffolding for silicon-based neural development. But in the presence of these specific minerals, it didn't just build, it overbuilt, in creating structures that grew faster than the Velkari nervous system could integrate, overwhelming the children's cognitive architecture until it collapsed under its own weight. She ran the analysis 3 times to be sure. Then she took her findings to Cale Tross. "You're certain?" he asked, studying the data she'd displayed across his office's holographic field. 97%, Amara said. "We'd need to run controlled trials to get to certainty, but the correlation is too strong to be coincidence." Cale Tross manipulated the display, rotating the molecular structures, examining them from multiple angles. "The minerals you've identified, vescarite deposits, are common throughout Velmore Prime's northern hemisphere. They've been there for millions of years. We've built entire cities on top of them." "I know," Amara said. "And they're completely harmless to Velkari physiology. We tested for toxicity, for interaction with silicon-based biology, for every known contraindication. But we didn't test for interaction with foreign protein scaffolding because we didn't know to look for it." She pulled up another data set. The Jupiter station, where we conducted the original trials, uses synthesized water. No natural mineral content. Same with the stations where the other successful deployments occurred. But here, on Velmore Prime, the children were consuming trace amounts of vesicarite through their normal hydration processes. Kale Tross was quiet, processing. Can it be reversed? He asked finally. Maybe. Amara highlighted specific molecular structures in the display. If we can flush the contaminated protein chains from the children's systems before the neural damage becomes permanent, we'd need to synthesize a binding agent that can target the overgrown scaffolding without damaging the underlying silicon matrix. How long? To develop the binding agent, 3 weeks minimum. To synthesize enough for 43 patients, another week. To administer it and confirm it's working, a month, Kyle Tross said. Minimum. Probably longer, Amara admitted. And that's assuming I'm right about the cause. If I'm wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now, Kale Tross interrupted. And if you're right, we might save these children. He closed the holographic display. Do it, he said. Whatever resources you need, whatever support. Well, just do it. Amara set up a temporary laboratory in Covenant Station's research wing. Shesila joined her on the third day, still moving slowly from the sedation, her crystalline body displaying colors that suggested exhaustion and determination in equal measure. You should be resting, Amara said. My daughter is dying, Shesila replied. I'll rest when she's safe. They worked in silence for the most part, falling into a rhythm that didn't require much verbal communication. Amara would run molecular simulations, Shesila would verify the results against Velkari biological parameters, and together they'd refine the approach until they had something that might work. Might. The uncertainty was a living thing in the laboratory, a presence that colored every decision, every calculation, and every hopeful breakthrough that turned into another dead end. On the fifth day, Amara looked up from her workstation to find Shesila standing at the observation window, staring at the medical wing where her daughter lay unconscious. I should have said no, Shesila said quietly. When you offered the treatment, I should have insisted on longer trials, stricter protocols, should have protected her. Amara set down the molecular analyzer she'd been calibrating. You wanted to help her, she said. You saw a solution to her suffering, and you took it. That's not wrong. It is if it kills her. It won't. Shesila turned, and her colors cycled through something sharp, almost accusatory. You can't promise that, she said. You don't know if this binding agent will work. You don't know if we're even addressing the right problem. You don't know... I know that giving up guarantees she dies, Amara interrupted. And I know that trying, even if we fail, means there's a chance she lives. Those are the only two certainties we have right now. She moved to stand beside Shesila at the window. I can't promise this will work, she said quietly. I can't promise we'll save your daughter or any of these children. All I can promise is that I will burn every resource I have, exhaust every possibility, try every impossible thing I can think of until either we fix this or there's nothing left to try. Shesila's colors dimmed. Why? She asked. Why invest so much in fixing a problem you created? You could walk away, return to Earth. Leave this mess to Velkari scientists who understand our biology better than you ever will. Amara was quiet for a moment, thinking about her brother, about all the times she'd wished she could go back and fix things, save him, make the universe cooperate. Because I can't walk away from children who are suffering because of something I built, she said finally. Because the universe has already taken enough from people I care about. And I'm not giving it these kids too. She turned to face Shesila directly. And because you're my friend, which means your daughter is my responsibility, whether you want her to be or not. Shesila's body chimed softly, colors cycling through something complex. Humans, she said, and it might have been criticism or admiration or both. You adopt problems like other species adopt pets. It's a cultural thing, Amara replied with a slight smile. They stood together at the window, watching the darkened children. And then they returned to work. The binding agent took 19 days to develop. Synthesis took another 6 days. The first trial administration was scheduled for early morning, station time. Amara stood in the medical bay, watching as Velkari physicians prepared the treatment, her hands shaking slightly from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Shasila stood beside her, absolutely still. The first patient was a 7-cycle-old boy named Thesicol. He'd been one of the earliest cases, one of the most severe. His crystalline body was almost completely dark, colors so muted they were barely visible. The physician administered the binding agent through direct neural interface, a process that looked uncomfortable even through the observation window. Then they waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. More minutes. Still nothing. Amara felt despair begin to creep in, cold and familiar. We were wrong. The theory was sound, but the application... Thesicol's body flickered. Just once. A brief pulse of pale blue near his central neural cluster. Then it happened again. Stronger this time. Blue spreading outward in slow waves. The physician monitoring his neural activity made a sound that the translator rendered as surprised hope. "He's responding," she said. "Neural pathways are stabilizing. The binding agent is successfully targeting the overgrown scaffolding." More colors appeared in Thesicol's body. Green, yellow, complex patterns that suggested cognitive activity returning, neural functions coming back online. He opened his eyes, focused on his mother, who was crying, properly crying, the way Shasila had described, in a sound that Amara had never heard a Velkari make before. "Mom?" Thesicol said, his voice weak but clear. "What happened?" His mother couldn't answer, just held him, her crystalline body chiming with harmonics that spoke of relief and joy and terror, that it might still be temporary. But it wasn't temporary. Over the next 72 hours, all 43 patients received the treatment. 41 responded positively, with full neural recovery projected within 2 weeks. 2 showed partial response. Better than they'd been, but not fully recovered. They'd need additional treatments, refined dosages, ongoing monitoring. But none of them got worse. None of them died. Shasila's daughter woke up on the 2nd day of treatment. Amara was in the laboratory when Shasila found her, the Velkari scientist moving faster than she'd seen her move in weeks. "She's awake," Shasila said. "She's asking for calculus problems. She wants to..." Her voice broke. "She's going to be okay." Amara felt something release in her chest. Tension she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. "Good," she said. "That's good." Shasila's colors cycled through every shade of gratitude and relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up, for staying, for caring enough to fix what you broke." Amara shook her head. "I broke it. Fixing it was the minimum I owed you." "No," Shasila said. "The minimum would have been walking away, letting Velkari scientists handle it, protecting yourself from the consequences. You didn't do that. You stayed and you fought and you refused to accept failure even when it seemed inevitable." She moved closer. "That's very human," she said quietly, "and I'm beginning to understand why that terrifies me." "Because we don't quit?" Amara asked. "Because you don't know how to," Shasila replied. "Which means you'll keep pushing boundaries, keep trying impossible things, keep breaking rules and creating problems, and then scrambling to fix them." Her colors brightened. "And the galaxy is never going to be boring again." Amara laughed, surprised by how good it felt. "Probably not," she admitted. They stood in the laboratory, surrounded by equipment that had been pushed to its limits, data displays showing successful treatments, evidence that impossible problems could be solved if you refused to accept impossible as an answer. "Why, come meet my daughter," Shasila said. "Properly, when she's awake and aware and herself." "I'd like that," Amara said, and she meant it. Because despite the crisis, despite the fear and the uncertainty, and the very real possibility that she'd destroyed everything she'd tried to build, They'd fixed it, together, and that mattered more than anything else. The summons came 8 months after the Velmore Prime crisis. Not a polite request, not a diplomatic invitation, a formal convocation order transmitted through channels that Amara hadn't even known existed, bearing authorization codes from the Sovereignty High Council itself. She was in her apartment on Covenant Station. She'd kept it after the crisis, spending more time in Velkari's space than on Earth these days, when the message arrived. Doctor, Amara Okonkwo, the automated voice intoned. You are hereby required to appear before the Sovereignty High Council at Core Station Alpha, concerning matters of galactic security and species integration protocols. Departure is scheduled for... She stopped listening. Core Station Alpha was the administrative heart of the sovereignty, the place where policy was made, where wars were authorized or prevented, where species were judged worthy of existence or quietly excluded from the galactic community. You didn't get summoned there unless something had gone very wrong or very right. Given humanity's track record, Amara was betting on wrong. The journey to Core Station took 4 days via the fastest commercial transport Amara could book. She spent most of it reviewing humanity's activities over the past year, trying to identify what might have triggered the summons. The Velmore crisis had been resolved. The enhancement protocol had been refined, safety measures implemented, deployment continued under much stricter oversight. Human research teams had successfully collaborated with a dozen sovereignty species on various projects. Agricultural improvements for the core, communication protocols for the semi-telepathic Essel, radiation shielding for species that needed to work in environments their biology couldn't normally tolerate. Nothing controversial, nothing that should have attracted High Council attention. But here she was, riding a transport toward the center of sovereignty power, with no idea what awaited her. She'd sent messages to Kael'Tros, to Shasila, to the Torth delegation that had been humanity's strongest advocate during the admission process. None of them knew why she'd been summoned, or if they did, they weren't telling her. Core Station Alpha was less a station and more a constructed moon. Spherical, massive, its surface a patchwork of architectural styles representing the dozens of species that maintained administrative facilities there. Velkari crystal spires rose beside Torth geometric complexes. Drum environmental domes clustered near Horm organic structures that looked more grown than built. The whole thing rotated slowly, generating artificial gravity through motion rather than exotic technology, because the High Council believed in demonstrating that the sovereignty's power rested on fundamental principles rather than advanced gimmicks. Amara found that either profound or pretentious, depending on her mood. Today, she was leaning toward pretentious. The transport docked at a receiving bay that processed her credentials with efficiency that bordered on aggressive. Security scans that went deeper than anything she'd experienced before, examining not just her physical body, but her genetic markers, her neural patterns, even her microbiome composition. Looking for what? She wondered. Evidence of tampering? Hidden weapons? Proof that she was actually human and not some sophisticated infiltrator. She passed all the scans. Eventually, then she was escorted, not guided, escorted, by armed security that made it clear this was not optional, through corridors that grew progressively more austere, more ceremonial, until she reached a chamber that made the conclave room where she'd first petitioned for membership look like a supply closet. Vast didn't cover it. The ceiling curved upward into what appeared to be direct exposure to open space, stars visible overhead in configurations that Amara's brain insisted were impossible. Some kind of holographic projection, probably, showing real-time positions of key sovereignty systems. The floor was polished stone, actual stone, not fabricated material, quarried from some planet whose name she didn't know and shaped by methods she couldn't guess. And at the far end of the chamber, arranged in a semicircular formation that suggested judgment and authority in equal measure, sat the High Council. 15 beings. One from each of the founding species, plus representatives from key allied civilizations. Kael'Tros was there, she noted with some relief, and the Velkari ambassador who'd voted for humanity's admission. But there were others she didn't recognize, species she'd never encountered. Beings whose forms ranged from crystalline structures that might have been cousins to the Velkari, to something that looked like contained plasma held in magnetic fields, to a creature that appeared to be nothing more than a pattern of light dancing across a specialized platform. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a voice said, emerging from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. You stand before the Sovereignty High Council. Do you understand the gravity of this proceeding? Déjà vu washed over her. This was how her first appearance in the conclave had started. Except this time, she wasn't a supplicant seeking admission. This time, she had no idea what she was. I understand, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber without need for amplification. The acoustics here were even more sophisticated than the conclave room. You have been summoned to address matters concerning humanity's integration into sovereignty structure, the voice continued, specifically regarding incidents that have raised questions about your species' suitability for continued membership. Amara felt ice settle in her stomach. What incidents? She asked. A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber. The first image showed a research facility. Human construction, but located on a sovereignty colony world. The second image showed the same facility engulfed in what looked like a controlled demolition. The third showed the aftermath, rubble, emergency response teams, and what appeared to be some kind of exotic matter containment breach. 4 months ago, the voice said, a human research team operating on Kesetar colony attempted to synthesize stable exotic matter using methods that violated 3 sovereignty safety protocols. The resulting containment failure created a localized space-time distortion that required emergency intervention from Kesetar military forces to stabilize. More images appeared. Different facilities, different disasters, all bearing the unmistakable fingerprints of human innovation pushed past reasonable limits. 3 months ago, human engineers attempting to improve hyperspace efficiency on trade routes near the Drom sector created a gravitational anomaly that disrupted shipping for 17 days. 2 months ago, a human medical team testing regenerative protocols on volunteer subjects accidentally triggered a cascade reaction that required quarantine of an entire research station. The images kept coming, too many of them. In each case, the voice continued, human researchers were attempting to solve legitimate problems, improve existing systems, advance scientific understanding. Noble goals, all of them. The display shifted to show casualty reports. And in each case, the results included property damage, economic disruption, and in 3 instances, injuries to non-human personnel who were working in proximity to human research facilities. Amara stared at the reports, her mind racing through explanations, justifications, anything that might contextualize the disasters into something less damning. But the numbers didn't lie. Humanity had been part of the sovereignty for a year and a half. And in that time, they'd caused more incidents, more disruptions, more near catastrophes than the previous 50 years of sovereignty operations combined. The High Council, the voice said, must now determine whether humanity's continued membership serves the greater good of the sovereignty, or whether your species represents an unacceptable risk to galactic stability. The chamber fell silent. Amara stood in that silence, feeling the weight of every delegate's attention focused on her. This was it. The moment humanity's grand experiment in galactic citizenship came crashing down. She'd promised careful integration, responsible innovation, contributions that justified the risks. Instead, she'd delivered chaos. I have no defense, she said finally. Someone in the council, she couldn't tell who, made a sound that might have been surprise. No defense? The voice asked. No, Amara said. Everything you've described is accurate. Human research teams did cause those incidents. We did violate safety protocols. We did create disruptions and damages and put non-human personnel at risk. She took a breath. We screwed up, repeatedly, in ways that were preventable if we'd been more careful, more cautious, more willing to accept limitations. She met the gaze of each council member she could identify, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. But here's what you haven't mentioned. In each of those incidents, human researchers were the first ones to respond to the disaster they'd created. When the exotic matter containment failed on Kesetar colony, the human team didn't evacuate. They stayed, worked alongside Kesetar military forces to stabilize the breach, even though they were exposed to radiation levels that should have killed them. She gestured at the display. When the gravitational anomaly disrupted trade routes, human engineers spent 17 days in hazardous conditions, barely sleeping, trying every insane solution they could think of until they found one that worked. They didn't walk away. They didn't hand the problem to someone else. They fixed it. Her voice hardened. And when the regenerative protocol triggered that cascade reaction, human medical staff spent 72 hours in quarantine working to develop a counteragent while being exposed to the same contamination as everyone else. They could have sealed themselves in protective gear, could have prioritized their own safety. They didn't. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "You're right to question humanity's suitability for sovereignty membership," she continued. "We are reckless. We do push boundaries past reasonable limits. We create problems that shouldn't exist, and then scramble to fix them in ways that probably violate even more protocols." She smiled slightly, without humor. "But we also don't abandon the messes we make. We don't ask other species to clean up our disasters. We stay. We fight. We exhaust every option, try every impossible solution, and we don't quit until either the problem is solved or we're physically incapable of continuing." The Velkari ambassador leaned forward, her crystalline body chiming softly. "You're arguing that humanity's tendency toward catastrophic failure is acceptable because you're willing to die fixing your mistakes?" she asked. "I'm arguing that humanity's tendency toward catastrophic failure is balanced by our absolute refusal to let those failures harm others," Amara corrected. "We're dangerous to ourselves, frequently, but we're not dangerous to you. That's a distinction without much difference," someone said. One of the species Amara didn't recognize, their voice translated through harmonics that suggested deep skepticism. "Is it?" Amara challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, the sovereignty has spent millennia prioritizing safety over progress. Building systems that are stable, predictable, carefully controlled, which is good, smart even." She gestured around the chamber. "But it's also left you with problems that you can't solve. Challenges that require thinking outside established frameworks. Questions that need answers you're not equipped to find because you've spent so long eliminating risk that you've also eliminated the kind of chaotic innovation that leads to breakthroughs." The plasma entity on the council pulsed with colors that the translator struggled to pass. "You're suggesting the sovereignty needs chaos?" they asked. "I'm suggesting the sovereignty needs someone willing to try things that might fail spectacularly," Amara replied. "Someone who looks at impossible problems and doesn't immediately calculate the risk-reward ratio before deciding it's not worth attempting." She pulled up her own holographic display, overlaying it with the Council's disaster reports. "Yes, we caused incidents. But let's look at what else happened in those same time frames." New data appeared. The exotic matter synthesis that failed on Kesetar colony. Before it failed, it produced 3 hours of stable exotic matter generation. 3 hours. The previous record was 47 seconds. The data we gathered during those 3 hours has already led to improvements in hyperspace engine efficiency across 17 sovereignty vessel classes. More data. The gravitational anomaly that disrupted trade routes. We fixed it by developing a new approach to localized spacetime manipulation that the Torth Science Directorate is now using to improve their quantum communication networks. More. The regenerative protocol that triggered quarantine. Once we'd resolved the cascade reaction, is we'd also solved the cellular rejection problem that's prevented effective regeneration therapy for carbon-based species for the past 3 centuries. She looked at each council member in turn. "We break things," she said simply. "Frequently, dramatically, sometimes catastrophically. But we also fix things, solve things, discover things that nobody else would have found because nobody else would have been reckless enough to try. Kyle Tross spoke for the first time, his voice carrying authority that silenced the murmuring that had started among the council. The question before us, he said, is not whether humanity provides value. That much is evident. The question is whether that value justifies the risk. Whether the sovereignty can afford to maintain a species in our community that treats safety protocols as suggestions rather than laws. He stood, descending from his seat to the chamber floor, moving until he was level with Amara. You've made an argument for humanity's contributions, he said. Now make an argument for why we should trust you not to destroy us all while making those contributions. Amara met his gaze. This was the real question, the one she'd been dancing around. You shouldn't trust us, she said quietly. Kale Tross raised what might have been an eyebrow. Explain, he said. Trust implies predictability, Amara said. Implies that you can anticipate our actions, rely on us to behave in consistent ways, feel secure in the knowledge that we won't do something catastrophically stupid. She shook her head. You can't have that with humanity. We're not predictable. We're going to keep doing things that seem insane by your standards. We're going to keep pushing boundaries, violating protocols, creating situations that require emergency intervention. She spread her hands. But here's what you can rely on. We will never stop caring. We will never prioritize our own advancement over the well-being of the species we're working with. And we will never, ever walk away from a problem we've created and leave someone else to deal with the consequences. Her voice softened. You asked me once why humanity sent a biologist to negotiate membership instead of a diplomat. I told you it was because we wanted to understand, to find common ground in shared curiosity. She smiled slightly. But there's another reason. Biologists understand that complex systems require diversity, that monocultures are fragile, that the healthiest ecosystems are the ones with the most variation, even when that variation includes species that seem chaotic or disruptive or dangerous. She gestured at the assembled council. The sovereignty is stable, carefully balanced, every species filling a specific niche, every relationship calibrated for maximum efficiency. Her expression grew serious. But stability isn't the same as resilience. A balanced system that never experiences stress, never adapts to new challenges, never incorporates disruptive elements, that's not a healthy ecosystem. That's a dying one. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Humanity, Amara said, is your stress test, your disruptive element, the thing that forces you to adapt, to reconsider assumptions, to remember that progress sometimes requires accepting controlled chaos. She paused. So no, you shouldn't trust us to be safe, but you can trust us to care, to fight, to stay when things get difficult and try impossible solutions when conventional approaches fail. She met Kaltros's gaze. The question isn't whether you can afford to keep us in the sovereignty, she said quietly. The question is whether you can afford not to. The deliberation took 6 hours. Amara spent them in a waiting chamber that was probably designed to be comfortable, but mostly just felt like a very polite prison. She ran through the conversation again and again, trying to identify where she could have been more diplomatic, less confrontational, as better at playing the political games that seemed to govern sovereignty decision-making. Came up empty every time. She'd said what needed saying. Now she'd live with the consequences. Finally, the chamber door opened. Kyle Tross stood there, his expression unreadable. The council has reached a decision, he said. Amara stood, her legs unsteady from sitting too long. And? She asked. Kyle Tross studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small expression, barely visible, but genuine. Humanity's membership is hereby confirmed, he said, with modifications. Amara felt relief flood through her. Then the word modifications registered. What kind of modifications? She asked warily. You're being assigned a permanent oversight committee, Kale Tross said. and 3 sovereignty representatives who will review all human research projects before implementation, monitor ongoing operations, and have authority to shut down any initiative they deem excessively hazardous. Amara grimaced. That's going to slow us down significantly. That's the point, Kyle Tross replied. The Council recognizes humanity's value, but also recognizes that left to your own devices, you'll eventually attempt something that results in genuine catastrophe rather than controlled chaos. He stepped closer. The Oversight Committee isn't punishment, he said. It's partnership. Species who understand your tendency toward reckless innovation and can help channel it in directions that maximize benefit while minimizing existential risk. He paused. I'm one of the 3, he added, along with Dr. Shasila and the Torth quantum specialist who's been working on your hyperspace improvements. Amara blinked. You volunteered for this? Someone had to, Kyle Tross said dryly. And I've spent enough time around humans to have developed something resembling tolerance for your particular brand of insanity. He gestured toward the corridor. Come, the Council wants to make the announcement formally. They walked through corridors that felt less threatening now, more like simple architecture rather than monuments to power. You gave them quite a speech, Kyle Tross said as they walked. The bit about stress tests and healthy ecosystems. Very compelling. It's true, Amara said. Ecosystems need disruption, controlled burns, invasive species that force adaptation, or elements that prevent stagnation. And you see humanity as the sovereignty's controlled burn? More like its invasive species, Amara replied, but the kind that ultimately makes the ecosystem stronger, even if it's disruptive in the short term. Kale Tross made a sound that might have been amusement. The Velkari ambassador said something similar during deliberations, he said. She argued that humanity's presence forces the rest of us to reconsider assumptions we've held for millennia. That watching you solve impossible problems reminds us that impossible is often just a failure of imagination. He glanced at her. She also said, you're exhausting, terrifying, and probably going to give her a stress-related illness before your species reaches its 100th year in the sovereignty. Amara smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one, Kyle Tross said. Mostly. They reached the main council chamber, where the full assembly had reconvened. The same delegates, the same overwhelming sense of authority and judgment, but somehow it felt different now. Less like standing trial, more like standing at the beginning of something new. The voice that had addressed her earlier spoke again, formal and ceremonial. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, representative of Homo sapiens. The Sovereignty High Council has reviewed your species integration record and has reached the following determination. A pause, weighted with significance. Humanity's membership is confirmed with modifications to operational oversight. You will continue to participate in sovereignty research, exploration, and diplomatic initiatives, be subject to review by assigned oversight personnel. The voice softened slightly. It is the Council's finding that humanity represents a unique and valuable addition to our community. Your tendency toward reckless innovation, while requiring careful management, provides capabilities that complement the sovereignty's existing strengths. The Velkari ambassador stood, her crystalline body bright with colors that suggested something like pride. In recognition of your contributions, she said, and in acknowledgement of the challenges your presence creates, humanity is hereby granted a permanent seat on the Sovereignty Research Directorate. You will have direct input into galactic scientific priorities and resource allocation. Amara's eyes widened. That was more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd dared to imagine. Additionally, the Torth representative added, human research teams will be integrated into critical problem-solving initiatives across all sovereignty sectors. When we encounter challenges that conventional approaches cannot resolve, humanity will be our first consultation. The plasma entity pulsed with colors. You will be our controlled chaos, they said, and the translator rendered it with something that might have been affection or might have been resignation. Our impossible problem specialists. Our reminder that the universe doesn't always respect our carefully constructed limitations. Kyle Tross stepped forward. "Welcome, humanity," he said formally. "Welcome to the sovereignty. May you break things carefully and fix them brilliantly." The chamber erupted in sounds that might have been approval or might have been concern or might have been both. Amara stood in the center of it all, feeling the weight of what they'd just been given. Not just acceptance, responsibility. The sovereignty wasn't just tolerating humanity's chaos, they were depending on it. 3 weeks later, Amara sat in a small cafe on Covenant Station, drinking something that approximated coffee if you were generous with your definitions. Shesila sat across from her, her crystalline body displaying colors that suggested contentment. "My daughter asked about you yesterday," Shesila said. "Wanted to know when you'd visit again. She has calculus questions that apparently only you can answer." Amara smiled. "I'm not sure I'm the best resource for Velkari mathematics." "You're the resource she wants," Shesila replied. "She says you explain things differently, more chaotically." "That tracks," Amara admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the station's population move through the common areas. Velkari, Torth, Draum, and increasingly humans. Species that had once been impossibly distant, now sharing space, sharing problems, sharing solutions. "Do you think it will last?" Shesila asked quietly. "This partnership?" Amara considered the question. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're going to screw up. Probably spectacularly. Probably multiple times." She met Shesila's gaze. "But I also think that every time we screw up, we'll fight to fix it. And every time we fix it, we'll learn something new. About the universe, about each other, about what's possible when you refuse to accept impossible as an answer." She smiled. "So yes, I think it will last. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Messy and complicated and occasionally terrifying, but real." Shesila's colors cycled through something warm. "Very human," she said. "Very Velkari to appreciate it anyway," Amara countered. They finished their drinks, coffee approximations and whatever Velkari consumed for stimulation, and then they went back to work. Because there were problems to solve. Impossible problems. The kind that required exactly the right mixture of careful wisdom and reckless innovation. The kind that required both species, together. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the sovereignty, in research labs and diplomatic chambers, and 1,000 small interactions between beings who had nothing in common except shared curiosity and stubborn hope. The galaxy learned what humanity had known all along. That impossible wasn't a limit. It was an invitation. And the universe was full of invitations, just waiting for someone foolish enough or brave enough to accept them.